Welcome to our final breakout of the afternoon. We are a small but powerful group. Welcome to our virtual participants. We so appreciate you joining us. We will hope to incorporate your chats or your questions, and I would invite questions of any kind related to Caseflow management, both from our virtual participants and those who are here in person. Because we're a small group, we can talk about some issues that might be critical to you right now. This content is part of the core competency on Caseflow and workflow management, one of the 13 competencies published by NACM. This particular session is part 2, talking about COVID-19. Can we make it be a Caseflow catalyst? I believe we can. So again, I invite your questions, your comments, your reactions, your curiosities, both for our virtual participants and those in person. All of the materials I'm covering are posted in the app, the presentation, and for this session there are 3 different worksheets or handouts, and we will be covering those as we go through the content. So I invite you to access those. If you do not have them in front of you, then I suggest you improvise. Think about the structure that's in these handouts and worksheets, and think about how you can apply it in your courts. Because this is a core competency topic, it's also being made available for the Core Champion program. So if you are participating in that, there is a document also posted in the app where you can respond to a structured question and then send it into NACM so that you can be enlisted in the Champion program as having attended this course. Okay, let's dive into this. This is part 2 of our Caseflow management fundamentals. This one is looking at what's the impact of COVID. We've all had some experience on this, haven't we? Just to recap, this is one of the competencies of the 13 NACM core competencies. We are, in this session, focused on Caseflow management, which is over here in the practice area. In other words, the practical, tangible things, skills that courts and court leaders need to know about running a court. Here is a slide that we saw in the earlier session, but we have some new faces. Just to recap, Caseflow management is the process of paying attention in cases. It's the process of knowing what's the flow of events, what happens in our cases, what are our time goals, how are we performing. It is the process of paying attention. Workflow management relates to the practices, the processes, maybe even the resources that your court needs to do Caseflow practices. For the purposes of this session, these two are intertwined. They're kind of all the same, encompassed in Caseflow practices. In this session, I invite you to think about evaluating how your court is performing. We used this worksheet in part 1. We're going to have it available again in part 2. Sorry for the repetition for some of you who stuck around the second time. You'll just get some remedial training. This is what I call the GROW worksheet. G for goal, R for reality, O for options, and W for way forward or will. What can we do to move forward? I invite you to have this worksheet or think about it or improvise using this structure. What are some things you want to do related to Caseflow practices? We will be talking about the impact and the influences of COVID. This worksheet might be a helpful document or structure to think through, what do I need to do as a result of COVID? What has COVID done or impacted related to Caseflow practices, and how do I need to think about it? So this is the GROW worksheet. It is in the app. This is a great problem-solving structure for anything, but we're applying it to Caseflow. Here is the listing of Caseflow best practices again, and these should look familiar to those of us who have been in courts for a long time. These best practices relate to from leadership, setting out goals, having expectations, having judicial support for Caseflow practices, using goals, in other words, time standards, time deadlines, having targets, settlement and dispute resolution processes, actions, sometimes called alternative dispute resolution. In some courts, this includes mediation, settlement conferences. There's any variety of settlement activities, the idea being have processes that help aspects, if not the entire case, settle, resolve, conclude at the earliest time possible. Next up, attention to the cases. Case attention and control. Paying attention to the inventory. What is the full collection of cases in your court? Do you know? We should. How old are they? Do you know? We should. Knowing where the backlog is. And again, backlog is the case group or caseload that is older than your target time standard. So if your time standard is cases should be concluded in 200 days, and when you take an inventory, you have cases that are 300 days old, those are your backlog cases. Events, paying attention to events and how you calendar and how you schedule and how you set each event to have meaning. So this relates to how's your docket structured? How are your cases calendared? Do you cluster bunches of cases together? Do you stratify them? Do you segregate certain types of events at certain times? This is one of the Caseflow best practices, is paying attention to that. And meaningful events. Every event should have a discrete purpose. If you look at your caseload and you see lots of status conferences or lots of motion hearings, what's the difference between them? Each event should have a discrete purpose. For example, the very first event, then a motions hearing, then a status conference, then a pretrial conference or trial readiness, then a pretrial conference and a trial. Every event along the life of that case should have a discrete purpose. If all of your settings are called the same thing, you will have less information to know how the flow of cases is going. And if you couple that with ample continuances, you are going to build a backlog, and you are not going to understand what's going on with your caseload. So these are fundamentals, rounding them out. Communication. Communication, collaboration, education, sharing with the judges, with the staff, with the justice system, with any player who can affect or be affected by your Caseflow practices. Last on this best practice list is monitoring, paying attention, being able to count, being able to measure, and talking about it and sharing it. Using performance measures like some of the court tools measures or some measures you may have built in your case management system. Here was a list of additional best practices that we covered in part 1. This list includes things like the ongoing evaluation, ongoing scrutiny. I like to say Caseflow management requires ongoing attention, just like the court's budget, just like ongoing attention of HR practices. Caseflow management needs ongoing attention. Managing the culture, being able to diagnose problems, being able to get information to diagnose problems. Related to that, actively solving problems. Do you see some delays occurring or building? Do you see some changes in what's happening with your flow of cases? This is where we would want to carry out the practice of problem analysis, problem solving. High performance courts concepts. This is where you are using certain concepts from the high performance court framework, like appropriate attention based on case need, individual attention to cases. Don't just cluster them all together. Remember, some of the concepts about procedural fairness mean that courts should make sure each case, each litigant has a voice, understands the process, feels that it's fair, equitable, that it's predictable. That's one aspect of high performance court framework. The other is measuring. Measuring what? You can measure these things related to case flow management. Efficiency, effectiveness, procedural satisfaction, and productivity. All of this content is enough for 2 or 3 days worth of courses. So we're getting it as a fire hose in 70 minutes, 75 minutes. So these are the proven practices. I suggest you go read the NACM core competency on case flow and workflow if you want to study it further. Go look at research and materials on the National Center for State Courts website, on the Justice Management Institute website, JMI. There's another group, the ILS group. Remind me what ILS stands for. There is another group, IAALS, that also has publications and research related to case flow management. Study them. These are the bread and butter of what our courts do. This is why our courts exist. In part 1, we also covered the purposes of courts and the increased attention to why we need to professionalize and pay attention to the flow of cases. We're not covering it in this session, but you could sure go study that further. All of these are great practices, and then what happened? Enter COVID-19. Enter COVID-19. Came in like a bang, caught us all off guard. What are some things you did as a result of COVID-19? You took some actions. I want your poll on this. Which one of these represents your face after you saw what happened? Raise your hand if this represents you. All is well, I'm smiling. Anybody? I don't see any hands raised. How about our virtual group? Anybody responding to this?
No one to that.
No one. Okay, how about this one? Is this what your face looked like after enter COVID? Holy cow, what's this going to do to us? This one's kind of middle of the road. I don't know what's going to happen. You'll vote on that one? And this is what most of us look like. Yeah. Uh-oh. Can you say freight train approaching? Yeah. We had all these great practices in place. Our courts were humming along. We thought we were doing good case flow management. COVID arrives. Some things were stalled. Some things changed. Some things were dead in their tracks. So let me ask for your feedback. What are some changes you actually made in your courts as a response to COVID? Those virtually, enter your content in the chat. Those present, raise your hand. What's something your court did related to case flow management upon the arrival of COVID? Yes?
We were paper files, so we engaged in a very quick process on imaging all of our case files.
The court was paper-based filing, but with the arrival of COVID, you suddenly moved to imaging and going more electronic.
Right.
Good answer. What else? Something your court did as a result of the arrival of COVID.
Suspended jury trials.
Suspended jury trials. Whoop, we're not going to do jury trials.
We had someone in the chat also say postpone
Postpone jury trials. Thank you, those on the chat. What else? What other things did some of your courts do when COVID arrived? Loosen up the timelines. Yes. Another chat response?
I have a few. Remote work,
Remote work.
remote hearings and work, acceptance of documents and reports by email.
Remote hearings, acceptance of documents by email. Who would have ever thought in past years we would allow that?
Right.
Yes, what else?
Added virtual hearings from home.
Virtual hearings from home? Who would have ever thought we would have hearings happening with someone working from home? With the judge working from home? Oh no, we have to be right here in this facility. Great list. What else is on chat?
We started holding virtual court, accepting filings via email and remote working.
Email filing acceptance, remote working. Okay, good answers. Anyone else assembled here? What are some other changes you made as a result of COVID's arrival?
Here's a good one. Implemented Adobe Sign for sentencing documents.
Implemented Adobe Sign, so digital signatures. Yes. How long have some of our courts, speaking from personal experience, wanted to do that? And look, it happened. Forced. We were forced into it. We were forced into change. So this was thrust upon us, and we did find ways to make these changes. Almost overnight. And almost under protest, but oh my gosh, we've got to do it. But now look what's happened. Here's my own list of things that I picked up on by reading postings and research. Do these ring true for you? Issuance of emergency orders declaring, here's how we're going to do things now. Here's how we're going to stop jury trials. Don't come on down. Interestingly, I was set to appear for jury duty on April 20th, 2020. And I was relieved of jury duty. You too? It's like, whoa, that was easy. We suddenly gave emergency orders, new declarations for how we were going to act. We modified our calendars, right? Maybe we fully abolished the calendars. We adjusted the daily processes. Do these ring true for you? Chat comment.
Yes, the chief magistrate in Fulton County said that they began to utilize phone-installed application to support accountability court participants with check-ins and other requirements.
Wow, you've got a lot there. The use of phone applications for communication, check-in, monitoring, and conducting events, in my words. Yes, and telephone indicates we didn't need super high technology. We used some of the technology available and got creative. And that goes to some of these boxes up here. New policies, new practices. I can remember hearing all timelines were waived, all regulations for submitting things were relaxed. I never, ever would have thought I'd see this in my court career. We did it. Changes to instructions. There was, I believe, an increase in trying to push out instructions and information and expectations for the litigants, starting with, don't come down to the courthouse tomorrow. So that was another reaction. Modification of access to records. How do people make requests to get copies of things? Do they? Is it delayed? What else is up? Relaxation of deadlines, rethinking our traditional business process. Rethinking, geez, we were following mandate number 1, 2, 3. Does that really work anymore? No, it doesn't. Changes in facility use and demand for different space configurations. I do not think we have seen the end of this one because the facility structure may need to be different for the safety protocols, but maybe we don't need to have courtrooms so big anymore. Maybe we don't need to, because we won't be having, maybe, as many people come on site, we don't need these great courtrooms. Obviously, technology's in here. What do you think about the bottom two? Anticipation of budget concerns. Did anybody experience that? I see some nodding here. What's the nature of those budget concerns? What were you faced with?
Well, we were proposed to hire additional staff, and due to the fears of COVID, they didn't allow for the additional funding.
You were proposed, you were going to get additional staff. When COVID arrived, funding may have been cut. Not only that, maybe the staff weren't applying now, didn't want to come anyway. Good one, yes.
Budget kind of got blown out of the water because we had to implement all of these things that weren't on.
Like what wasn't in the budget when COVID?
I mean, everything.
Technology, supplies. I know I was on a committee meeting and heard TJ Bement say, "Sorry I'm late, I just had to ferry a bunch of face masks and hand cleaner to the courts in my county."
Yeah.
And none of that was cheap early on. And you couldn't get it in our budgets. Plexiglass.
Working from home, whatever, everything.
Oh my gosh. Think of the mammoth change of deploying laptops or whatever technology. Budget was blown out of the water.
Someone in the chat said can't cover operational costs with increased caseload.
Can't cover the operational costs with increased caseload. It makes sense that that's a challenge. Now, I propose that we need to be using caseflow management best practices to manage the caseload so we can try to stress or stretch our existing resources. What else?
Here's another budget issue with implementing new virtual technology and reallocate resources.
Implementing new virtual technology and reallocating resources. Boy, I bet a lot of court staff in the future are going to be more focused on how to manage and use the technology and less focused on what do I do with the paper.
Additional costs of employees out of sick time needing to be home due to COVID-related illnesses.
So budget costs for employees out on sick time related to COVID, maybe related to fears of COVID, maybe having been exposed. Yes. So all of these affected the budget. The last item up here is different collaborations and with new partners. Who might a new partner be that we interacted with during COVID's arrival? Federal government. Federal government. Who else might be in this list apart from the federal government? County public health. Who would have thought the court would be considering the public health department as a justice system stakeholder? Yes. Even medical professionals. So a whole slew of things happen. Is there anything missing from this list?
I think even changing our relationship with current partners like the jail.
Changing the relationship with the current partners like the jail, that's a good one. Like the jail for the in custody or detention, maybe with marshal service or security people, maybe with facility people to help control the building access, probation, interviewing clients. So these all arrived, or COVID arrived, and this is just a snapshot of some of the things that were changed and in quick order.
Local nonprofits offering rental and social welfare assistance.
Oh, that's good. So this court experienced local nonprofits offering rental and social services, social welfare services, which could come in handy for a lot of the litigants. Yes. These all had an impact on case flow management. So what are your concerns related to case flow after the arrival of COVID and these massive changes? If I say, what are your worries going forward?
We had a huge onslaught of cases being filed by prosecution that they've just kind of sat on for the last year, like 20 to 25,000.
Onslaught of cases coming in as a result of the prosecution, getting them in the court system.
And virtual hearings. We couldn't issue, warrants or anything from
and virtual hearings, kind of catching up because no warrants were issued while everything was held in abeyance? Yes. What else? Other examples. What are your worries?
Starting over.
Starting over.
It was easy to shut the court down. It's a lot harder to bring it back.
Well, in doing that, bringing it back, knowing that we may have to be able to ramp back down again.
Starting over, starting back up, ramping, incremental. These are okay worries. You've got a lot of company on this. I saw an interview of a couple of court administrators that said, if I had known more about the duration of COVID-19, I would have approached this more as a marathon, not a sprint, or something to that effect. Now that speaks to, could you really have spent some more time planning? I don't know, because this was in our face. We had to make these changes overnight, within days. This is all part of leadership duties that we can use going forward and figuring out how we deal with these massive changes. So we're back to our list of fundamentals and we're asking, how is your court performing on these now that COVID has arrived? And we're back to this additional list that included evaluation and problem solving and using high performance concepts. So I want you to take a moment and think about these up here. How are you performing in terms of carrying out the purposes of courts? How are you performing in terms of making sure you have litigant access? We know that litigant access was drastically truncated with COVID. On the other hand, litigant access was increased because they could appear virtually, which for many of our users was easier. How about those users who can't get the technology to access? How are we doing in that? COVID allowed some courts to ramp up their thoughts about self-represented litigant, information, expectations, instructions. And with the posting on websites and social media, some courts really rose to the occasion and worked on that. How's your court performing in terms of managing the culture? Is everybody still scared? Are all the system stakeholders operating back to normal? Probably not. There's probably still some fear, right? And how are you performing in terms of basic caseflow practices? How are you doing on high performance court practices? Are you still able to measure things? Are you getting data? Are you using data? Are you publishing it? Are you discussing it? Maybe, maybe not. I gotta just get by today. Yeah. Do we have any chats coming in? Okay. So here are some normal reactions to change. We're in a normal state. Something happens. Then we go into survival mode, which survival mode could be putting on the blinders, diving right in and making change. After the survival mode, we do somehow find a way to rebound and adapt, right? We have seen courts do that. And then we begin recovering and transforming and creating what lots of people call the new normal. In this chart, I've called it the next normal. The next normal. This is a traditional sequence of events. Something happens, we kind of have to catch our breath, figure out what we're going to do about it, begin walking forward. Does this look familiar? Okay. Here is a news source I came across that describes this in a different way. We have been evolving in our thinking and our acting. And let me walk you through this. Our evolution started with COVID arrives. Uh-oh, what are we going to do? Deer in the headlights. Then we were in the fear zone. This was sudden, this was massive, this was unpredicted, we were unprepared. Uh-oh, between now and tomorrow, I've got to figure out how to notify the litigants. Uh-oh, between now and tomorrow, we've got to get technology so all of our staff can take it home, or whatever version was in your environment. The next evolution, we go into a learning zone. This is where we begin responding, pivoting, if you will, adapting, and here's a mention of relaxing the rigor, thinking there are some things I can do. There are some things our court can do. We can halt events, we can relax the policies, we can raise or waive the deadlines. We begin modifying things. This begins our learning zone. Next is the growth zone, where we are really into creating. Well, since we found out we can use Zoom for all these events, let's move our docket to Zoom. Since we found out the participants can respond and participate to a greater degree, less failures to appear, let's put all our dockets in this using technology. Simplifying, applying new processes. This is what's called the growth zone. I think we are now at the enlightenment zone. And at this zone, the one on the far right, we really need to and are being leaders, using leadership skills to figure out what to do, to lead our way out of this. As Justice Bridget McCormick said, this was not the change we needed, nor the change we wanted, but this was not the change we wanted or asked for, but it is what we needed to get off the dime, get creative, implement, change, use technology. The bottom line is we are all different as a result of COVID. We now have different lenses to look at our practices, right? We are thinking about policies differently now. We are thinking about appearances. We are thinking about technology use differently, right? We are in the enlightenment zone. I'm going to show a slide. I want you to look at this slide and then tell me what your assessment is of this. Here's the slide. Take a second. What do you see here? How would you describe this to me? What do you see here? Huh? Room for growth? Great. Where do you get room for growth? A dot with a lot of space around it. Room for growth. Very good. Who else? What do you see here? I know. That's not fair. He gave the good answer right away. Way to go. So sometimes people say, well, there's a dot, it's in equal size, it's in the middle of the page with equal white space all around it, it's nicely centered. The point in this slide is, are we looking at the dot and focusing on that one thing, or are we looking at the big picture? There's a lot of white space up here. It's more than just the black dot in the middle.
Right, someone in the chat commented opportunity.
The chat says, and thank you, opportunity. So we shouldn't just focus on the problem we just had. We should focus on the opportunity. We should focus on the white space. Don't just look at this horrible thing that happened to us and our courts, but look at what's come out of it. And much has come out of it. Here's some source that says, here are some things, advice for remote hearings, and it gives us things to do and think about. Like, take a look at the rules, redo the rules, identify whether a virtual, in-person, or hybrid appearance would be appropriate. What technology? Think about technology and deploy it. Maybe revamp the docket and the calendar schedule. After all, many of our courts lived with no dockets for a while. Maybe we can kind of start fresh and rebuild. Decide what we need to do for communicating changes, expectations, new policies, new protocols. So this is one source giving us advice on things to consider related to remote or hybrid hearings. Over the last several years, there's been research focusing on civil cases, family justice cases, and criminal. This slide summarizes the findings from that research, and they are pertinent related to case flow management practices, and they are pertinent related to how the heck do we deal with what COVID has done to us. Look at what's up here. These are case flow fundamentals up here. Pay attention to case management from filing to disposition. Use certain pathways. In other words, certain services based on the case need. Triage cases. Review cases when they're filed. Know what's been filed. Know what the issues are. Know how complex the case is. And then moving over to the right on criminal case research, here we see mention of leadership. Pay attention to the governance of the court, maybe of the criminal justice community and coalition. Pay attention to governance. Have goals. Have time standards. Communicate, collaborate. Use deadlines. Use trial certainty. Here's another source. This came from the Justice Management Institute talking about a checklist for dealing with criminal justice partners. This is practical. Here's an actual checklist. Think about postponements, suspend certain dockets. Review conditions, review the bail and release conditions. A lot of this happened as COVID was playing out. Postponing, extending deadlines. Notifying, and look at what's on the bottom of this list. Start working on backlogs. Start paying attention to that flood of cases that now will be brought by the prosecutor because they've been in abeyance for 14 months. Here's a slide that has pandemic caseload recommendations. These are case flow basics in this list. They're case flow basics. Stop the continuances. Don't let liberal continuances occur. Have fewer hearings if you can. Why are you shaking your head?
No, I'm agreeing with the reduced continuances.
That's always everyone's favorite. How do we do that? Incrementally is my answer. Incrementally. And it starts with pulling data, see what you've got. If each case has 6 continuances, work to get it down to 5, then 4, then 3. Couple that with each event needs its own discrete purpose. Couple that with pay attention to the time goals. These are case flow fundamentals. Rule promptly. So if you wanted to help your court, your judges, your bench rule promptly, what would it take? Education, revisit time standards, evaluate what the data is telling you, firm cutoff policies, monitoring progress. These are all good suggestions that came out from the Court Statistics Project. These are case flow basics. Here's another list. Use case management and scheduling orders. That's something that courts that are really working well on case flow management do. Have a scheduling order. It provides expectation, definition, deadline, what needs to happen. Here again, limit continuances, this says limit the number of appearances. Now you could take that a couple of ways. Manage continuances, or do you actually have fewer appearances as part of the sequence of events for the case from filing to dispo? I don't have an answer. You could customize this based on your court and your caseload needs. Modify procedures, do early discovery, anything you can do to load up case attention, preparedness early on will help that case move to conclusion quicker. Here's a list of strategies in times of uncertainty. What do you think of these? Look what's on here. These relate to case flow fundamentals too. Have the right people at the table. Identify some assumptions, some drivers, even identify some areas where you just don't know. You have uncertainties. Imagine and begin to prepare for futures that are going to look different, plausible futures. Isolate strategies. This takes me back to this GROW worksheet. What do you want to do? What's your goal? What are some of the current realities? Maybe limited staffing, limited resources, but maybe there's a current reality of everybody's now more willing to rewrite policies. What are some of the ways forward? What can you do to start it? This just came out from Fast Company. Strategy in times of uncertainty. I'm on to the next one. Don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions. If we're starting over, if we're refreshing our case flow practices, don't make assumptions. Don't just stick to the way it was done before. Invite colleagues. That speaks to communicate, collaborate, interact. I like the next one. Inquire and communicate with colleagues. Didn't we hear our plenary speaker today talk about interacting, asking, how are you today? How's it going? I always like to ask, when I was in the court and I had problems, what do we need to do more of? What do we need to do less of? And what do we need to do differently? More of, less of, differently. And asking it in a non-adversarial or critical manner. This says, make time for reflecting. While we may think we don't have time for it, reflect on this while you're here at the conference. Reflect on some of the things and the lessons learned that you have heard. Ultimately, we define new ways, new norms. Here's some of the lessons learned. Leadership is really critical. Being adaptable, nimble, but using strategic thinking. Thinking about where the pressure points are, the demands are, using technologies, apply the lessons learned. There's a whole set of these lessons in these slides, so I invite you to take them back and think about which can I use. In fact, some things are better as a result of COVID. Some things are better. Better response rates by litigants, better use of technology, outdated policies being trashed or rewritten. Some things are better. What do you then think are your biggest challenges when you go back and say, I want to right the ship for case flow practices? What are some of the challenges? I've listed some here, but does anyone want to raise your hand and suggest a challenge? What do you think your challenges will be? Consistency, that's a good one. We were faced with consistency problems before, but now maybe we can make some progress. Politics, good one. Do we have any chats? Budget, yes.
Falling back and picking up old bad habits or instead of taking changes that we've made that build
A big challenge is going to be falling back into old habits and just kind of going back to the way it was instead of really going into new processes and new practices and creating something that's maybe more efficient. Yes?
We have two. We have resistance.
Resistance.
And we also have justice partners preparedness.
Justice partners preparedness. we in the courts, we as leaders should not forget helping to prepare the justice partners. What are we going to do going forward related to new policies, new mandates, new rules, new deadlines, new calendar structures? That's a good one. What other challenges? As I thought about this, I added the two at the bottom. Do we want to focus on mandated processes or discretionary processes? We might want to focus on mandatory till we get them nailed down. But if we could throw in a sprinkling of, we're going to do some discretionary things because it's good practice, and do we do massive change or incremental change? These are okay challenges. I showed this in the earlier session. Here's another reminder about some strategies. Inventory, know what you have, use information, gather it, talk about it, and remember the court user. Comment.
Question, on the previous slide, I think potentially the changes, I feel like if you don't have your top echelon of your court structure that's implementing changes, as you go down to your trial courts, and if the Supreme Court of your state isn't going to make the changes, or isn't keeping the changes, maybe they suspended some rules, or during that time when they put all that back in play, we're really kind of hamstrung by what we can, our capabilities to make some of the changes that we may feel necessary, but they're going to force us to go back to some of maybe things prior to COVID, which may not have been already efficient.
So your comment was, if you don't have the top echelon ready to push this, support this, collaborate on this, you may be hamstrung, and some of the creativity and options you could create out of this may not be able to come to life. And we on the front line in some of these courts, we can see how to solve some of these problems, but we're not allowed to. That is something for us leaders to navigate, and maybe to push as far as we can, and maybe to deal with it incrementally. A chat comment.
Yes, but a question actually. So the question is, when considering how to best handle virtual hearings going forward, what are your thoughts on hybrid hearings, and any thoughts or advice on the logistics of who should be virtual and when, and how to coordinate that in a hybrid approach?
Good question from the chat. When considering virtual or hybrid, and I'll add or old style, events, what are some considerations? What else did I miss from that?
And then any advice or thoughts on the logistics of they say who should be, but I'm gonna say what cases should be virtual and when, and how to coordinate that in the hybrid approach.
And thoughts on which cases should be virtual and when, and how to, if you're doing hybrid. I don't think I have a perfect answer, but my instinctive answer is know your inventory, know where you have backlog. If you can tackle the backlog, whether it's virtual, hybrid, or old style, get that taken care of so that you then have the purest group of cases that's fresher and newer. But you kind of have to manage both. Don't let the backlog get out of hand, and you have to be ready for the ones now still coming in. That's one answer. Another is, what are your priorities? What is your court set as a priority? Is it the self-represented litigants? Is it the family court cases? Is it the criminal cases with mandated deadlines? Maybe the civil cases can kind of be held in abeyance for a while. Maybe those rules can stay relaxed. I don't have the ultimate answer other than know your inventory, know your court's priorities, know what your court wants to look like when you come out of this. We all know that during COVID, the rules were relaxed, and so everything we thought was gospel is suddenly put on the shelf. Are there aspects of that that we want to allow to continue? Well, we still finesse the new way. Who else would answer that question, or who else would pose another question? Yes?
Something we looked at was the length of hearings. And if they were shorter hearings, we would focus those on more being virtual to save people coming into the courthouse for a 5-10 minute hearing.
The comment was, look at the length of the hearing or the event. And the shorter, that might be subject for the quicker virtual access, because we sort of presume it's less complex. And the ones that need more time or more direct interaction, those might be better for hybrid or in person. So that's kind of a version of prioritizing. Maybe you prioritize by case type. And many of our courts don't have the full array of case types anyway. So among your caseload, how do you begin? We cannot eat the apple all at once. How do you figure out how you're going to take bites of the apple? Other comments, questions, reactions? Yes?
So what we did was we took everything virtual, and now we're coming back, and our bench made the decision. We really like the protection orders being done over over the internet or over virtual instead of in person.
So the comment is the bench in his court really likes some of these protective orders being done virtual because there are a lot of benefits from that. Okay?
So we're going to bring all the criminal back because that's what the attorneys were asking for. And then from there, we'll figure out what we can do, what they liked doing virtual and what they need to do in person.
So then this court will collaborate with the attorneys and figure out what they can tolerate, what they will support. Now that speaks to, let's pull out one of the Caseflow fundamentals of communicating and talking about leading this enterprise. Can you engage with those partners to say, what do you need? What do you need? What would work for you? Doesn't mean you're going to accept it, but you're asking for feedback. So this goes to one of the fundamentals of communicating and practicing leadership to define how you're going to operate. Very good. Anything in chat? A-okay. So here's this strategy sheet again, which goes from inventory, assess, analyze, evaluate. It is time for us to rejoin a normal. We still can define what the normal is. Through COVID, we learned lots of change can happen and fast. Here's this list of best practices. We had this in the earlier course. For those who are eye-limited like me, look at this in the app. This is a listing of actual, tangible practices stratified by each fundamental area. Here's the list, or the worksheet that I call the GROW worksheet. Use this as your tool to evaluate what can I do, where do I get started, starting with what do I want to do, where can I get started. I want to share a couple other thoughts with you. Here are other models. We already looked at GROW. Goal, options, goal, reality, options, way forward. Well, in this chart, there's another one called OODA. Observe, orient, decide, and act. OODA. It's actually called the OODA loop. It's a problem-solving cycle. And then on the right is another version. It's called WOOP. Wish, in other words, envision the future or the outcome. Think about the outcome. What do you want? Envision it. Begin to prepare for it. Think about your obstacles and plan. When we think about OODA, just picking that one out, it involves observe, review what's going on, inventory, get data, assess, study it, identify. Might be identify your backlogs, might be identify your priorities for righting the ship on Caseflow. Orient, assess, study what you've found. Maybe even talk about it with your colleagues, your partners. Decide. This is where we start saying, okay, we found this array of issues. Which ones are we going to tackle? This is the D in UDA. And lastly, act. Begin and start working on the process. These are described in an article posted on the National Center for State Courts online trends. So you can go read further about using these 3 techniques: GROW, UDA, and WHOOP. Here are some thoughts or prompts for you. One source I found said, when thinking about coming out of COVID and implementing change, we should think about change in these areas. And they are service delivery. How are we going to change the service delivery? In what ways? Where? What services? Operational practices. What are we going to change? How are we going to change our operational practices? Where do we revamp them? Where do we revert to prior ways? Next up is policies. Where can, how can, do we need to write new policies? Monitoring is on here. And lastly, paying attention to the workforce. What do we need to make sure we have ready related to the workforce? Here's another eye test for some of us. Here, using those 5 categories, are case flow management practices to consider. They've been grouped in these categories: service delivery, operational practices, policies, monitoring, and workforce. Give me some reaction to this. Does this make sense? 5, maybe the term would be lines of delivery or lines of service or lines of engagement. How does this play with you? Does it make sense? My thought was, this is one way for us to take the big task ahead of us and to start chunking it out. Okay, of what we need to do, what falls under service delivery? What do we need to have in mind for access for litigants, or providing information to litigants, or services for SRLs? What falls under the chunk of what do we need to think about in our workforce? And I have on this chart, and again, this is in the app, you can go get this and download this document. I have populated each of these categories with case flow related actions. So let me pause. Do we have any comments or questions on chat? Not as of now. Let me see what questions we have from those assembled here. Does this make sense? Yes? We are, in one sense, returning to case flow best practices. Let's go to what we know, but let's package it in ways that COVID has instructed or forced us. Anybody have a question? Okay. I'm going to close with a story. In conclusion, whatever we do, we should think about the case flow fundamentals: leadership, communication, using goals, measuring, being clear about expectations, providing information. We should return, and we should let COVID help us be a catalyst for revisiting what's proven, what works. We might tweak some things. We might want to study further what are our priorities for virtual, hybrid, or old style in person. But whatever we do, we should remember those that use our courts. And to illustrate that, I'm going to read a story. And the story involves an alien spaceship that has been observing life on Earth. The alien scouts report the following conclusions. Earth is inhabited by metallic creatures called cars. These vehicles are the dominant species. Each car owns at least one two-legged slave who cares for it. Each morning, the slave goes outside its home and wakes up the car. The car is taken for its nourishment to what is called a gas station. And then the car goes to its social club to be with other cars. The club is called the parking lot. Meanwhile, the slave goes to work to earn money to take care of the car. Who's the master here? Especially with gas prices now. At the end of the slave's workday, the car bids farewell to its friends at the parking lot, and the slave takes the car back to its home. On days when the slave is not making money for the car, it washes the car or takes it for a drive and shows it a lot of different places. The bottom line is, sometimes viewed through alien eyes, the world can be interpreted in very different ways. Let's remember, as we do whatever we're going to do to improve case flow management, how is it being interpreted? How is it being seen? What's our role as a leader to communicate? What's the court's purpose? What are our case flow fundamentals? What are our case flow practices? What do we need from you, partners or litigants? And what are we going to do in the new case flow world? So that concludes our last section. Are there any remaining questions from chat?
There are none.
Excellent.
Just a comment, this was a great presentation.
Oh, thank you. I will accept that one. Thank you for hanging in the afternoon session, and think about your car the next time you're out there. Who's the slave and who's the... Wow. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a great evening.